Welcome to Cover to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols, and this is author interview number 876. Our guest today enjoys a busy life, so much so that even just listing her careers on the way to being an author takes a while. Denise Haynes has been a flight attendant for British West Indian Airways, an advertising clerk for the Trinidad Guardian newspaper, a tutor, teaching assistant, and college lecturer for a decade, a Spanish interpreter for the Court of Appeals in Bridgetown, Barbados for 7 years. But as they say in those infomercials, wait, that's not all. Her longest career was as a lawyer in private practice for 16 years in Barbados, from which she mostly retired in 2021. She grew up in Trinidad as the youngest of 10 children, currently lives in St. Peter, Barbados. Her debut novel, Talent Show, focuses on one remarkable family, and we're very pleased to welcome the remarkable Denise Haynes.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for that introduction. I barely recognize myself. Okay.
Yeah. Before we touch on the book, though, I do want to find out a bit more about you as a person.
Sure.
And one of the questions I often like to open with was, were you always going to be a writer? But despite all your other careers, you told one interviewer that as a child, you insisted you were going to publish novels. Well,
Yeah,
now you've done it,
I
but
did.
you've actually been writing other things before that. Can you tell us about the first time you saw your work in print and the types of things you wrote before Talent Show?
Right. Okay. Well, the first time I saw my work in print was an article in an in-flight magazine for a regional airline.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really quite cool because I discovered by accident that the famous French writer Victor Hugo had a daughter who lived in Barbados.
Ooh.
And she'd followed someone here, love makes
Mm-hmm.
people do things. And she'd followed someone here, and I decided this is too good to keep to myself.
Oh,
So I
yes.
wrote an article, and it was printed in a regional airline. And that was pretty cool seeing my name in print. And it brought me back to my childhood and how I would walk around telling everyone, I'm going to publish books when I get older. And, they'd laugh and say, oh, sure, yeah, 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 yeah. So there was that. I did some literary criticism when
Mm-hmm.
I taught at the college at UWI, the local university. And that was also interesting, seeing my name in print, but on a different type of
Mm-hmm.
topic.
Yeah.
It made me feel even more convinced that I wanted to be the writer, not just the critic.
Oh,
So it took me to a talent show.
thank you. That was fascinating. I also want to ask, when you were teaching, what subjects were you teaching, and in what branch of the law did you practice? Should say, do you practice? Because I think, like me, you're theoretically mostly retired.
Yeah, that's the word. Yeah. Well, when I taught French, mostly Spanish language, and I taught Latin American literature, and I taught a little bit of French because languages were always my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I practiced law, I did a lots of family law.
Mm-hmm.
I did some civil litigation, company litigation, commercial and otherwise. And then I've dialed back on those. And at the moment, I only do what we call non-contentious, which is like wills
Mm-hmm.
and power of attorney. And if people are buying real estate, really buying or selling property, I can do the legal work.
All right. Fantastic. I love that. Um,
Yeah.
of course, obviously, everything we do, all of our
Mhm.
experiences come to bear on our writing. Which of the various jobs inform your writing the most?
I think when I was a flight attendant, I mean, you were busy on your feet and stuff, but I just really enjoyed seeing the different types of human beings that exist and how everyone had all their different quirks and habits and so on. So maybe that one, but I think more than anything, when I was a lawyer, I I think I saw a different side of humanity. You see what people are like when they're in those situations. And I realized how painful it was for people. And also because I did family law, I also realized how important family was. Having said that, you're under strict confidentiality as a lawyer. So I would say while that allowed me to see what people are like in those situations.
Mhm.
I didn't exactly put any of that into my
Mhm.
writing. Yes, I think there were contributions from everything I did, but maybe the most recent one is the most important one, which is law.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the book itself. How long did it take you to put this together? I mean, in one sense, your whole life, but and again, when you actually started working on till you got it ready to
Yeah,
go.
yeah. I started at the beginning of the pandemic in
Uh,
March 2020 when I said I realized I had written bits of it before because when I started writing it, I thought, oh wow, that piece that I wrote years ago now flows in here.
ah.
So yes, I was writing it before that, but I did start in the mean in March
Mhm.
of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic. The world went quiet. My phone
Yeah.
was the hook, and I thought, this is it.
Yeah.
And even when things resumed, I by then I was so consumed with it that I made sure I made time for it. And then I would say that I was satisfied enough to send it off I sent it off to a friend who was doing the editing for me in about February of 2022.
Mhm.
And she told, we discussed and so on, and I offered it out and it was accepted in September of 2022.
That's very good.
Yeah, so like 2 years roughly, and then
Mhm.
it took another because it was my first novel. Things like the cover and so on. I hadn't even thought of those things.
Yeah.
So it took me about 18 months between acceptance and publication.
Yeah. And that's pretty standard, though getting it done in 2 years and getting it accepted so quickly, a lot of authors would love to be able to say that. So,
I was quite surprised myself because I had been told not to expect too much,
yeah.
and I was prepared to keep offering it out for years and years. But I was lucky, yes.
Which tells me, as having read the book, I can agree that there's talent there and interesting story. The book itself has a very unusual structure, and I read lots and lots of books, but it focuses on the Roberts family in Trinidad. The first 22 chapters, something over half the book, is told from the point of view of Eddie Roberts, who marries Susanna Carrillo, and they have 11 children. And a big chunk of life is the talent show, where each has a chance to show off. Because, as you point out, I think multiple times, almost every one of the younger characters says how tough it is to get attention with all the other people around.
Yeah.
And then part two is called The Contestants Speak. And so each of them get a chance to have their own viewpoint. And we'll have to ask a bit about that. And then in part three, you have two viewpoint characters from outside the family, the nuclear family. That's Carlos, the father of Susie, and Eugenie, a cousin of hers, and then Jenny, the youngest, comes back in for a coda or a wrap up. So my first question is, as somebody who was the youngest of 10th, do you identify more with Jenny than the other kids in the book?
Um, I think perhaps, but there's a bit of me in some of the others as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but yes, I maybe if I had to identify with one, it might be Jenny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And using her to close out, I thought was brilliant, the way it just kind of wrapped it up. So nice
Yeah.
piece of design in that.
Mhm.
Um, there are a couple of aspects that I would call supernatural hints in the book. One of them is that Raymond and Jenny can see things that other people can't, including knowing instantly if somebody's good or bad, and sometimes, unfortunately, being able to predict when somebody is going to pass. And in a couple of cases, seeing what appears to be the ghosts of the departed.
Yeah.
Um, that is obviously intentional. I think it adds a little extra to it. Was that there from the beginning, or did you go back and add that later?
It came out as I wrote. It
Hmm.
came out as I wrote. My decision to have Eddie speak from the afterlife,
Hmm.
I think I sat and that was what came. What would it be like if a dad could come back and sort of, you know, grab a microphone and start talking about what it was like to be a dad
Yeah.
during his life? And so having started from there, the rest of it I found evolved because it's really a sort of alternate version of my family and friends.
Hmm.
So I do actually know people who have some of those abilities and or you're free to believe or disbelieve, but I know people who have some of those abilities. And so those are partly based on people I know.
Hmm.
And but it came out really as I was writing. It just flowed. I didn't add it after it came
Okay.
out. And when I wrote it and I shared some of it with my daughter, she says, "But mom, this is like magical realism or something." And I thought, okay, if that's what you call
Sure.
it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's good enough for Carlos Castaneda. By golly, it's good enough for you.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and one of the nice little touches. Now, we used to call things Easter eggs, little things that are put in that you go, oh, that's a nice touch. That's clever. And it's not intended to be intentional. Look at me, I'm clever. It's just like, oh, she knows this. One of the
Mhm.
things you talk about is those were the kids that were born with a membrane, what they call a caul in the
Yeah,
South over their face, and they are traditionally said to have the ability to see that.
yeah,
So
yeah,
nice
yeah.
touch, nice research. Appreciate
Thanks.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I have to say, and I was coming to that where I said, I'm reading along and say, this is very interesting. And all of a sudden I get to the sentence, I think it's page 34, where Eddie says, they were nice. I had loyal to them. But after I died, I went, wait a minute here. This is not a sentence you usually encounter in your reading.
Yes, yes, yes. So that's when the little hint was given that this is where Eddie is speaking from. Yeah.
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 The other thing I really like about it is there are distinct personalities to all of those kids, and you had to come up with personalities for all of them. How much of that is real life and how much of that is, oh, this is my neighbor and that's the trait from this guy down the street?
Yeah, some of them are my cousins.
Uh-huh.
Some are based on siblings, but the personalities are different, the outcomes are different.
Hmm.
Some are neighbors
Hmm.
on the street growing up.
Yeah.
So it's really a mixture of.
Did any of your neighbors say, is that me in the book here? Have they come to you yet?
I haven't heard from any of my neighbors because, that was a long time ago.
That's true. How about your relatives?
Uh, One brother did ask me, which one am I? I hope I'm not that one. I hope I'm one of these. I didn't answer him. I said, you can be anyone you want.
Oh, that's the perfect answer,
Yes,
obviously.
yes, yeah.
In fact, that's an experienced teacher and lawyer answer. Exactly, right there combined.
I guess so.
You you have so much of the culture of the island in it.
Mhm.
Um, but also in terms of character, the whole family revolves um, around the mom, and Susie never says a word in it. The whole no and so it feels like what the artist is doing is, in this case, painting with negative space by defining all the outside of it. You never see the inside, but the lack of it there shapes it in its way. And I'm sure that was purely intentional on your part.
It was intentional. And I love the negative space
Mhm.
analogy because that's exactly what I was thinking. I'm a very amateur painter.
Ah.
Uh, I took up painting maybe 10 years ago, and I was always fascinated with negative space. I'm not
Mhm.
very good at drawing, but the negative space I really liked. So when I was doing this book, I'm very visual as well. So when I
Mhm.
was writing the book, I found myself being very visual. And when I came to Susanna, I really took a long time to decide whether she would say anything. And I decided that the best tribute to her would be to have her as negative space because she is such a presence without saying a word.
Mhm.
And I also found it a bit difficult to find her voice because she was spoken about by so many others that then I didn't want to detract from the image of her that had been built. And I found that finding a voice tended to run that risk. So I decided to let Susanna be that level of presence in the novel.
What's
Yeah.
also interesting is this feels so real of the time because
Mhm.
you set this. I mean, I think that you talk about in the 70s, all of the upheaval and whatnot. So
Yeah.
this is something that's grounded in reality and also makes some comments on the social aspects of living where they are and the times that they are. because of the influence of the Catholic Church being so strong.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And it was that part of it was something that they say, write what you know.
Mhm.
So that part of it was definitely known to me. Uh, and my parents always, they would vocally say that they could not have raised a large family without the church. We, the kids, used to joke and say, but there may not have been a large family without the church. So but yes, it was very much their culture and their comfort, and even beyond my parents, my mother's family, they were very much about, the church being the background of your life, the foundation of your life, and so on. So that's something I lived. I myself am not currently religious in the traditional sense, but I have great respect for that background I was raised in.
Mhm.
And some of my siblings are still very religious, and I totally respect that.
Yeah. I have to say, as we record this, this is just a day after they announced the new pope was going to be an American.
Yes, yes, indeed, yes, yes.
But not only American, what I found fascinating was that he is a Peruvian national because he moved to Peru for 20 years to help the poor. And
Yeah,
that tie back and forth, I think, is really good. They call him the international person. So I hope that's the case. Yeah.
yeah, I do too. Yes,
All right.
yes.
So I
Yeah.
wandered off of the topic, but I thought it was
That's fine. Yes.
appropriate. You have so many interesting, you write little bits and pieces in here that I tend to think of as seeing, well, like on a cross stitch someplace as a little advice to people, and things like, and I'm flipping through looking for my where I put in my notes the thing I was going to ask you about just now. So, but it's something like people are always different, or there are circumstances that change. All of these little things, and then you build on that. So it's kind of a what we used to, as old newspaper people talk about, the inverted paragraph. You start with the most important thing, and then you add details afterwards.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
the long way to get to the question is, did you outline before, or did you just organically write?
I organically write.
Ah,
I organically write. I am almost finished with my second novel at this point.
mhm,
And that one, I did have some sort of structural notes and
mhm,
so on for it. But as far as possible, I tried to organically write. But Talent Show was organically written.
mhm.
I didn't have much structure. It came as it came, I wrote it.
Yeah. And it's interesting to find all these bits and personality indicators, what we call the telling touch, the revealing thing about them. Each one of them have they're different. When this one is very close to mom, this one is a bit of a cut up. I
Mhm.
semi-identified a little bit with loving to be on the microphone because I worked in radio and still do. Uh, but it's all how we got the attention, what they did, how they lived, how their lives changed and diverged. In many ways, it's a multiple coming of age story. I never thought about that till just now.
That's pretty true. I never thought of it that way, but that is pretty true. Yes, it is.
Mhm.
It is. And it shows us really, I mean, we all know that, it takes all kinds to make the world.
Mhm.
But I think what I realized at some point was that this was showing people what's behind the person. So
Ah,
you
yeah.
go on and you say this guy's, but you don't know what it was like for him when he was growing up. And so I think behind everyone is a little bit of their family background. And the
Mhm.
further away they get from the family in terms of years of, the older you get, the more you become your own person. Uh, but in some way, there's always still that little bit of you that comes from your family, or whether it was whatever type of family it was, that I think remains with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is also a lot of moving around in here. There, yeah, go off to Venezuela here, go off to here, come back
Yeah.
and forth, and some go to stay, and some coming back and forth. And I
Yeah.
suspect, is that characteristic of the island life?
It used to be much more so, but it
Mhm.
is very much so. For example, my husband's father, he worked in, I think, two other Caribbean islands. He worked in Aruba or Curacao, Dutch West Indies.
Mhm.
He worked in Venezuela. He worked in Trinidad, but he's really from Barbados.
Uh, and
And
that's why
so,
you're in Barbados, right?
yes, there's that movement. Um, and my own brothers, my own siblings, uh, some are in Florida, some are in Venezuela, some are in Oregon, and
Oh,
so on. Yeah, some are in Canada, etc. So it's very much when you grow up on an island, I think you're very aware that this isn't all there is.
mhm,
So you look out to the world. And some, even today, the movement between the islands, the English-speaking islands, is quite marked. It's quite noticeable. So yeah, it's a pattern of life in these parts. And in back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, before there were all these controls, it was something people did without even thinking.
sure.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I find interesting as well is I can tell your linguistic background, and I think
Mhm.
in the very best is in Jeannie, the next to
Gene.
the last. She
Yeah,
talks about I'm probably going to mispronounce it, the Creole and the Patois and the
yeah, yeah,
similarities. And they're all. And the thing I like is she says this was kind of a gift among us when we were slaves. We didn't have
yeah,
much else. What an
yes.
interesting observation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's something that I heard. I do have family in the French Caribbean, and it was interesting because in Trinidad they spoke a form of patois based on French, and so they could. It wasn't exactly the same, but they could understand each other. And I heard a relative say once that that was a little gift that we all shared. And I
Uh,
asked her what she meant, and she said something along those lines.
yeah.
So I think that was those were her words. And as when I asked it at the age, I think I might have been 13 or 14, it seemed so fascinating to me,
Uh,
remained with me. And I got to put it into talent show.
as we pull everything out, all of the stops, everything that comes to us is possible uh, uh, fodder for our mill, as it were. Um,
Yeah.
wow, so much. What was the hardest one to write? I would think maybe Carlos.
Carlos was really hard to write.
Yeah.
Yeah. Carlos was really hard to write because he had been painted before. And as I told you, I because Susanna had been painted and described before, I couldn't find her voice. And it was a little like that with Carlos, but I succeeded in finding his voice. But he was definitely the hardest one to write. Yeah.
Because and for our listeners, Carlos was Susanna's father, who was really angry because she got pregnant. Not only she got pregnant, she got played to an Anglo, for gosh sake, and not even anybody from who spoke Creole or anything. He was just an
Yeah.
Anglo, and he didn't use when the kids came. He didn't use their traditional names. So, uh, and he was kind of a nasty guy in a way.
Yeah, he was a nasty guy. And that's what made it hard to write.
Yeah,
But also to show some sort, shed light on why he was nasty
yeah.
was that he grew up with such pain that that was his way of processing it or dealing with it.
Yeah, and you mentioned that he says that all I can do is get angry. He called me blue angry at one point. I think that's
Blue Vex, yes.
yes, yes.
Yeah,
Um, I have to ask about the second book. Is it anything like this, or is it totally different?
it's totally different. Um, but I tend to have a particular way of experiencing and looking at life. So it's a reflection of life again, something that I think everyone will identify with. And I think this time, just looking back at it this week, because I'm sending it off to the editor next week.
All
And
right.
having last look at it, I realized that it's totally possible to read one section and don't read anything else and still get everything that you need out of that section. So in
Wow.
a way, they are the sections interlock, but they can also be taken separately. And so even people who are not into reading an entire novel can find a bit to read and enjoy.
Yeah.
So it's much like, I think, a box of chocolates, you can you can pick out the one you like. Yeah.
Classic, classic. And Yeah, that is an intriguing way to go about it. Really interesting in that. What when people finally get through this delightful book and they put it down, what do you want them to take away from reading Talent Show?
Yeah. I've thought about that a bit. There's just quite a few things. I think one of the things is that uh, how different we all are. And as I said before, how family informs people. So the guy at the office who's really hard to get along with, or the lady at the office that's really hard to get, just realize that they're probably doing their best, even if it doesn't look like it to you. And they probably have, if you could reach behind them and look at their background and their history and all that they have lived and known and seen, you might be quite surprised. And you might then have a better understanding. But at the same time, it's saying that um, as human beings, it's 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 natural for us, it's normal as human beings to want to be seen and heard, whatever the context. And we find ways to do this, even in a big family or a big company or whatever.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things. And I think too, realizing for myself, I have two children, and realizing that your parents had a life before you came along,
Yes, yes,
and you had an impact on that life, and sort of realizing, maybe wondering who they were as people and who they are as people now and how things changed. I think we tend to look at parents as providers and, guidance and everything. And as we got older, if we're lucky, companions or whatever. But I don't know that we ever really descend on who they were before you came along, before they met, and who they were as the kids came along and who they are now,
yeah.
as a reflection of all of that. Yeah.
Wow.
So those are some of the things.
I
Yeah.
appreciate that. That's a very thoughtful answer. Let me throw one more at you. And is there anything we've not touched on you want to make
Well, and
sure
I
our
should say as well, that
yeah,
I had a comment from someone and I was really quite touched, but he said, thank you for making the dad such a big part of it, because so often in a family and in parenting, dads take,
yeah,
the kind of background, and the mother's at the forefront because her role is more obvious. But people don't realize how observant dads can be and how they can see things because they're not so close to the kids. So I think that's something too that I would like people to walk away with.
okay.
That, fathers have a particular role and could be quite useful for providing a different perspective on the family.
And interestingly enough, as you have examples of both, because I think it's Vicky's husband Bill turns out to be not as attentive as her father was.
Yes, there's one of the husbands, and yeah, correct. Yeah. And yeah, so it shows the contrast in,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I've started to ask if there's anything we haven't touched on you want to make sure also gets in the book or in this interview.
Well, one of the things I think was that what I liked, there was one character there, um, and I believe it was the one Ronaldo, the one who was very talented, but everyone thought he was lazy.
Mhm.
And I enjoyed writing that. And every time I do a reading and I choose that to read, everyone has a great time with it because he's so honestly lazy and he says it. But behind that laziness, he still has ambitions and he still has talents. And then he explained that he found out at a point in time that he was dyslexic. And that's why that laziness, that apparent laziness, was really about just not dealing with stuff that back in those days was not really obvious to everyone.
Yeah.
And no one knew how to deal with it. No one even knew it was a thing. So I think I enjoyed that. And it's a little bit of a sense of when you know yourself and when you discover things about yourself and you pay attention to yourself, you can blossom in life. And everyone has that little blossom in them and they can make it happen if they just, you know, take care of themselves and honor themselves. Yeah.
That, folks, is wisdom. Thank you for sharing that with us. I do appreciate that.
Yeah.
Our guest today has been Denise Haynes. The book is Talent Show. It is extremely recommended by this particular guy. And we certainly hope that you will come back when book two comes out and talk to us again.
Thank you, Roger. Yes. And the book is available on, Amazon, Kindle. I have a website, denisehaynesauthor.com. You can read excerpts, you can read more about me. And it's also available on audiobook recently.
Ah.
So, yeah, and Barnes and Noble and so on. So
Oh, I'm
um,
sorry. I was going to close it out, but I have to ask you about the audiobooks. Did they do justice to the voices of the characters?
I didn't have much control there. I did
Yeah.
get to select from a range and I
Hmm.
picked one, but I think that it was very well done. But maybe at some point, people have said to me that they like the way I did my readings. So maybe at some point I might do an audiobook, but because of, legal
Yeah.
restrictions, I have to wait a bit before I can do that.
Yeah.
But it seems that people like it. It
And
seems that
yeah,
message comes through.
I
Yeah.
think in part because I can hear the islands in your voice, and I
Yes,
love that.
yes. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
in the reader's voice, she tries, but
Hmm.
she's not from the islands.
Yeah.
Uh, she's actually British.
Yeah.
But there is a closeness, because all the islands were once owned by Britain, and so
Yeah.
she's familiar enough that she can adapt certain expressions and so on.
We'll have to check that out. Hey, thanks so much for being with us today and providing some real wisdom, I think, along the way.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for reading the book, knowing so much about it, and for having me. It's been a pleasure.